All right. Let me now bring in a real estate, very well-known real estate economist, but economist broader than that for sure. And this is David Medani of Capital Economics. And David, you've been calling for a number of years for a Canadian housing correction. Do you liken what we're seeing here right now to the 1990s?
Well, if you look at home ownership costs, all-in home ownership costs, not just the mortgage payment, but all other costs that we typically associate with home ownership. In Toronto and Vancouver, we are back to levels that we saw in the late 1980s. And this is home ownership cost as a proportion of household incomes. So on that metric alone, it does sort of certainly feel the same way. I think one thing that's different, other than the fact that interest rates are low, is that house prices are much, much higher relative to household incomes than they were back in the late 1980s.
Which means what to us?
Well, it means affordability is very bad. And what that means for a lot of households is that they're struggling to, save for retirement. They're struggling to raise families. So that's why I think the affordability is actually a big problem in Canada. And I think it potentially could get worse over the next few years if we begin to see the mortgage rates just begin to edge up. They don't have to go up sharply like what we saw back in the day, but even just a moderate increase in rates, I think, would make the affordability picture even much, much worse than it is today.
So is that one of the examples of where things might even be worse than they were in the late 80s, early 90s? Because we look for the comparisons of people saying it's not as bad or that, but is there something else new that's coming along that makes our situation even more dire than that?
Well, I go back to look at house prices relative to household incomes. And on that metric alone, it's worse now than it was back in the late 1980s in Toronto and in Vancouver. The overvaluation is not as severe as in other markets, but we have seen a broad run-up in home prices across the country. It's not just the Toronto and Vancouver, but people often talk about Toronto and Vancouver because that's obviously where most people live. So, I think there are some pretty big similarities, but I think it's actually worse than what we saw in the late 1980s. Of course, low interest rates helps, but I think low interest rates is actually part of the problem. It's why we're seeing the overshoot in terms of valuation. It's why we're seeing the overinvestment in the high-rise condominium market. And so, I'm still very much concerned about the housing market generally.
David, walk us through how you see this playing out in the sense that whether or not it's a small increase in interest rates that puts additional pressure on households, or whether it's job losses really stemming from the lower oil prices, as Greg's chart pointed out to us in terms of what that would then do to housing prices. Walk us through how you see this playing out, because I don't think people can actually picture it, particularly because Canada did come through the financial crisis so well.
Well, I mean, I often get asked what would be the trigger or catalyst for a correction, and the thing with asset bubbles is you only know what the trigger catalyst is after the fact, and that's why I sort of tell clients we should be paying attention to the indicators of imbalances, so valuation, look for signs of overbuilding, look for signs of household financial leverage. So it's always tricky to try and guess what the actual trigger might be. I mean, obviously one scenario is mortgage rates creeping higher, and that's obviously going to mean mortgage costs as percentage of incomes goes up. And already we're strained now on an affordability basis. So I think that's one scenario. You start to see mortgage rates creep up. You see worsening affordability, and then you see a big downturn in the residential construction. And even just residential construction alone is at a historically high level now. As a percentage of GDP, it's close to 7%. So, the scenario that I see, well, at least one scenario that we see is mortgage rates creeping up, but not sharply. Then we see prices begin to plateau and come down, and then we see the big downturn more on the residential construction. And as I mentioned, close to 7% of GDP, so there's a lot on the line here. There's a lot of construction sector jobs on the line. So I think that will be sort of the scenario that I see playing out. One thing I think that is different in Canada vis-a-vis the US, for example, because everyone compares the two, is I don't think we'll see the bankruptcies in the banking sector like what we saw in the US. I don't think you're going to see that nasty feedback loop from the banking sector back onto the real economy. Because in the US, you had banks getting into trouble, and therefore household access to credit was constrained, right? So that made the downturn just in the broader economy, in terms of things like consumption spending, that much worse. So I don't think we'll see that severity, but I do think you'll see prices and housing come down. I think you'll see the big downturn in residential investment with the knock-on effects that you would expect in the construction sector.
As the markets in Toronto and Vancouver get more and more expensive, a lot of people are blaming foreign ownership. You and I had discussions about this before, even yesterday at a conference we were at, about the fact that even though we don't have a hard number, that's not really the important thing. It's more the perception of the foreign ownership in this market.
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of data on it. We know it's happening. because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that says it's happening, but we don't know to what extent. But I think the other thing too is it's sort of the perception. I think Canadians have the sense that in Vancouver and Toronto there is a sense that there's a lot of foreign cash coming in, and that's pushing up prices. And so there is a sense if you don't buy now, you're going to miss out forever, because foreigners are only going to push prices even higher in the future. So get in now while you can. I don't think it's rational, because I don't think prices can keep rising relative to household incomes when they're already strained right now. But I think that is sort of one indirect influence that foreigners is having.
David, last question here, but you've given us your percentage decline in terms of housing values in the past. What's the update?
Well, I would say at the national sort of average level, I'm a macroeconomist, so I'm looking for 30,000 feet. So I'm saying 25 to 30% on average. But obviously a market like Vancouver and Toronto, I think potentially could be hit that much worse, just because the imbalances here are that much greater than other parts of the country.
David, good to be with you. Thank you.